This is Leo Tolstoy at the end of his life, a man who spent 80 years systematically tearing down the aristocratic world he was born into. He began as one of Russia's wealthiest landowners, only to spend his final decades trying to give it all away. That journey started at Yasnaya Polyana, his family's massive estate. But for Tolstoy, extreme luxury was no shield against loss. By the age of 9, he had buried both of his parents. His brother Nikolai tried to comfort him with a story about a green wand buried in the estate's forest. Nikolai claimed that carved into this wand was a secret formula that would end all human suffering and make everyone happy forever. It was a child's myth, but it took root in Tolstoy's mind. As he grew, the search for that magical wand became an agonizing, lifelong attempt to fill the void left by his parents' death. His first attempt to fill that void was through excess. As a young man in Moscow and St. Petersburg, he burned through his inheritance on heavy gambling and drink, accumulating debts he couldn't pay. To escape his creditors, he followed his brother into the army in the Caucasus. There, he lived among local tribesmen who existed outside the complex laws of the city. He watched them live off the land, seemingly free from the anxieties that haunted the Russian elite. But the Crimean War soon stripped away any romance he found in the military. At the brutal siege of Sevastopol, he spent 11 agonizing months watching common soldiers die in the freezing mud, while generals and politicians made fatal errors from the safety of distant rooms. He realized that war wasn't a path to glory, but a crime committed by governments against their own people. The green wand wasn't in the army. He would have to look for it in the power of the human mind instead. Tolstoy returned to civilian life as a celebrated writer, but he found the city's literary circles to be just as hypocritical as the military. He retreated back to his estate and married an 18-year-old woman named Sophia Bears. On the night before their wedding, he handed Sophia his private diaries. He insisted she know every detail of his past, his addictions, his debts, and his previous relationships, believing that a life without total transparency was a life built on a lie. With Sophia managing the estate and transcribing his drafts, Tolstoy spent the next 15 years immersed in his writing. He dedicated 6 years to War and Peace alone, crafting a narrative that attempted to capture the entire scope of the Russian experience. In these books, he argued that history is not driven by great men like Napoleon. Instead, the world is shaped by a massive tide of microscopic actions taken by millions of ordinary people, peasants, soldiers, and mothers, whose names never appear in textbooks. By the 1870s, Tolstoy possessed everything a person could ever dream of: unmatched global fame, a vast estate, a large family, and immense wealth. Yet, at this moment, he was hit by a paralyzing dread. He realized that if death eventually erases everything, then his books and his riches were meaningless. He began hiding ropes and rifles from himself, terrified that he would succumb to the urge to end his own life. Searching for a reason to stay alive, he looked to the peasants working his own fields. They faced starvation and back-breaking labor, yet they accepted their lives and their deaths with a calm that Tolstoy lacked. He concluded that these workers possessed a knowledge that wealth had blinded him to. They didn't live for status or legacy. They lived for simple faith, nonviolence, and the physical labor of the earth. This realization changed everything. He renounced his wealth, declared that owning land was an act of violence against the poor, and broke away from the Russian Orthodox Church. He was horrified to see priests blessing weapons of war, using the name of God to justify the very state-sponsored killing he had witnessed at Sevastopol. He began dressing in simple peasant tunics, became a vegetarian, and insisted on mowing his own grass and plowing his own fields alongside his former servants. He was no longer searching for a magical stick in the woods. He was trying to live out the secret he thought was on it, stripping away the illusions of society to see if anything real remained. Tolstoy's new philosophy of absolute nonviolent resistance began to ripple out of Russia. His letters and essays were translated into dozens of languages. His writing reached a young lawyer in South Africa named Mahatma Gandhi. The two began a correspondence that would directly influence the nonviolent methods Gandhi later used to challenge the British Empire. But while Tolstoy was inspiring movements abroad, his home life was disintegrating. Sophia fought him constantly to protect the family's estate and the copyrights to his books, which she saw as their children's inheritance. To Tolstoy, continuing to live as a wealthy landlord in a house full of servants was a daily lie. He was an 82-year-old man who could no longer tolerate the gap between what he wrote and how he lived. In the middle of a freezing November night in 1910, Tolstoy fled. He left a note for Sophia and walked out into a snowstorm, finally escaping the estate that had become his prison. Days later, he fell ill and died on a wooden bench at the tiny Astapovo train station. It was exactly the kind of modest, lonely death he had spent decades trying to achieve. He was buried at Yasnaya Polyana in a simple funeral. There were no priests, no state honors, and no monument. He was laid to rest in the exact patch of forest where his brother had once told him the green wand was hidden. After 80 years of searching, he had returned to the only place where the secret had ever truly existed.